So let's talk about how one family's ambition, a single pill, and a really clever marketing plan basically unleashed a national crisis. And the thing to remember is this wasn't an accident, it was all by design. To really get this story, we have to go back, way back, to the 1940s, to a huge mental asylum called Creedmoor. This is where three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, all worked as doctors. And they saw firsthand just how brutal and misunderstood mental health treatment was back then.
I mean, we're talking about things like lobotomies and electroshock therapy, procedures that often just left patients as empty shells of who they used to be. After seeing this day in and day out, the brothers got completely convinced that there had to be a better way. They thought, these are chemical problems in the brain. They need chemical solutions.
Okay, so the eldest brother, Arthur Sackler, he wasn't just thinking about creating new drugs. He wanted to completely change how they were sold. He essentially wrote a playbook, a set of marketing rules that would make his family billions and, well, have some pretty devastating consequences down the line.
Here's where Arthur's genius, if you want to call it that, really kicks in. He was willing to just completely ignore ethical lines. He came up with these techniques that were, totally revolutionary and really dangerous. He'd hired doctors to sell his drugs to other doctors. He paid off regulators. He even made ads with fake doctors in them, all to push addictive drugs like Valium for something as common as everyday anxiety.
So what happens when people start raising alarms about addiction to his products? Well, Arthur came up with a defense that would become the family's go-to line for decades. It's not our product, it's the patient. Blame the victim. Now, Arthur actually died before the opioid crisis really blew up. But his family? They took his playbook and ran with it. See, they had a major business problem. Their patent on a big money pain drug was about to expire and they needed a new blockbuster fast. And their solution was a pill called OxyContin. What they did was they took this incredibly strong heroin-like opioid called oxycodone and put their special time-release coating on it. But here's the key. Their goal wasn't just to sell it for, severe cancer pain or end-of-life care. No, their ambition was way, way bigger. They wanted to market this to everyone for common stuff like back pain, to create a true billion-dollar pill. To do that, of course, they needed the FDA seal of approval. And the way they got it was, well, it was really unusual. They got so close with the FDA reviewer, a guy named Curtis Wright, that they actually helped him write the official review of their own drug. I mean, that's just unheard of. And then, surprise, surprise, about a year later, Wright leaves the FDA and gets a huge job at Purdue. So what came out of all this? This one single, incredibly vague sentence on the drug's label. This little sentence became their biggest marketing weapon. Is believed to reduce the abuse liability. Believed by who? Based on what evidence? It didn't matter. It was FDA approved, and that was all they needed. Okay, so armed with that FDA label, Purdue launched one of the most aggressive sales campaigns you've ever seen. And it was all built on a single shocking lie, a statistic they hammered into every single doctor in the country. But where did they even get it?
You're not going to believe this. The whole less than 1% addiction claim, it came from a tiny 5-sentence letter written to a medical journal way back in 1980. It wasn't a real study. It wasn't even about OxyContin. And it was based on a small handful of patients in a hospital. They took this completely irrelevant piece of paper and sold it as scientific fact to doctors who were already being told they needed to treat pain more aggressively. It was the perfect lie at the perfect time.
And boy, did it work. Sales shot past $1 billion a year. And that's when the horrifying consequences of this massive lie really started to bubble up all across the country. So, when doctors started calling Purdue saying, hey, my patients are showing clear signs of addiction, they're having withdrawals, Purdue had an answer ready. They just invented a fancy-sounding term, pseudo-addiction. And they told doctors the solution wasn't to stop the drug, but to prescribe an even higher dose. Well, it didn't take long for people to figure out that if you just crushed one of these pills, you could bypass that whole time-release thing and get a massive heroin-like high instantly. With millions of these pills flooding towns everywhere, a huge black market just exploded. Crime rates went through the roof, and the drug got a new nickname, hillbilly heroin.
Now you might be wondering, did the Sacklers know this was happening? Oh yeah, they knew. Internal emails that came out later showed they were fully aware of the abuse. But instead of doing anything about that, the company president, Richard Sackler, just laid out their strategy. Stick to Arthur's playbook. Hammer the abusers, blame the people getting hooked.
So let's be super clear here. While Purdue's PR machine was out there blaming reckless criminals, the reality was totally different. Many of the people getting addicted were just ordinary folks with pain who trusted their doctors and took the drug exactly how they were told to.
As the body count just kept rising and the crisis was spiraling completely out of control, the first real legal challenge was finally made to try and hold the company accountable for what they'd done. So, in 2007, Purdue gets taken to court and fined $600 million for their fraudulent marketing. Now that sounds like a lot of money, right? But to put it in perspective, look at this. They made 3 times billion from OxyContin that same year. For the Sacklers, this wasn't a punishment. It was just a cost of doing business, a speeding ticket.
So, was justice served? Not even close. The executives who pleaded guilty got 0 jail time. In fact, the Sacklers gave them bonuses. And after promising they'd change their ways, Purdue immediately doubled down, hired more salespeople, and kept raking in billions. And that decision had this devastating ripple effect.
See, as doctors finally started prescribing fewer opioids, a whole new, even deadlier crisis took off. Millions of people were already addicted, and now their supply was cut off. The numbers are just staggering. 4 out of every 5 new heroin users had started with a prescription opioid, like OxyContin. They were forced to turn to the streets.
Then, when this massive $8 billion federal settlement finally came down in 2020, the Sacklers had one last trick up their sleeve. For years, they'd been quietly pulling money out of Purdue, over $10 billion, and hiding it in personal offshore accounts. So they left the company as an empty shell, declared bankruptcy, and then offered a tiny fraction of their fortune in exchange for total legal immunity, forever.
$80 billion. That's the estimated cost of the opioid crisis to the U.S. economy, every single year. And that number, it doesn't even begin to capture the human cost for the hundreds of thousands of people who've lost their lives.
I mean, the scale of this is just hard to wrap your head around. The crisis that the Sacklers kicked off has literally changed the way people die in America.
So it leaves you with this really unsettling question, right? This whole crisis wasn't an accident. It was a business plan to profit from pain. So what happens when a family can ignite a public health catastrophe, make billions from it, and then just use that money to make sure they never face any real consequences? What does that say about our system of justice?